Good afternoon, everybody. So our whole afternoon session is going to be focused on what we can do to enhance PGR recruitment. And we thought it would be lovely to have a guest speaker who has been doing a lot of work in this area. And Scott is a professor at the University of Manchester, so he's going to lead the initial discussion here, and he has also led 3 phases of CDT now, I think, in the energy sector. So the current CDT is the Saturn CDT, but you are also the Associate Dean for postgraduate researchers, so experience at a university level and also at a centre for doctoral training level in this area. So thank you very much for agreeing to talk.
Thanks, Becky. Is it clear how I move this? Oh, yeah, there's next, and I can cope with that. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm conscious that you've all had your lunch now, so my job for the next 25 minutes is to try and not let you fall asleep, because now you've had that after lunch lull. I'm stood here. I mean, firstly, thank you for the invitation. I feel very honoured to have that. And I'll be honest, I'm stood here really nervous because I have absolutely no professional qualification, no reason why I should be stood here, except that I would say that I'm an individual that's passionate about equity and inclusivity in actually recruitment at all stages, but for the last 6 years, predominantly in PGR. And that's really for very personal reasons, so I thought it would probably make some sense, and if you'd indulge me, just to tell you a little bit about my journey and how I got to where I am, because I hope that explains where my passion, and that's probably the only qualification I have for standing here before you today, where that comes from. So, I mean, we've had all about backgrounds. I'm very old now. I'm in my late 50s, but I was the first of my family to go to university. And it wasn't something I ever thought I'd ever do. My parents are incredibly proud of me. And in 2001, which actually isn't all that long ago, I was the first female member of staff that the chemistry department at the University of Manchester had ever appointed. And I joined there as a married young academic with 2 very young children. In fact, that's not quite true. When I was interviewed, I was still pregnant with my son, and by the time I actually took up my role, I had essentially a baby of a few months old. I'm dyslexic, but I don't actually view that as a disability. I view that as my superpower, because I think differently to other people. I certainly have to approach problems and situations to other people. So I turned up at Manchester, and honestly, when I was first in the chemistry department, I remember after they'd appointed me, a professor turned around and went, "But where's she going to go to the toilet?" And that was in 2001, which is really shocking, right? But since then, obviously, lots of things have happened. So after that, I was a single parent with 2 young kids. That was pretty tough, being a full-time academic in a university like Manchester with 2 young kids. Then I met my next partner, who was a woman. So then I became a gay woman with 5 kids under the age of 7, trying to be a full-time academic. That was pretty tough too. And then 4 years ago, I transitioned. I'm now Scott. I met my wife. So now I consider myself a straight man in a Faculty of Science and Engineering. And the really strange thing about that is I got to where I got to, in my opinion, the hard way, okay? But I also now know what it is to have white male privilege. And people that don't know me and don't know my journey assume that I got to where I got to having white male privilege. So knowing all those things has completely opened my eyes in this sort of background. And I realise that's a bit self-indulgent, but I think it's important that you understand maybe where I came from. I'm also going to preface this by saying I'm taking this as a safe space. Some of the views and things that I express here about my institution are my personal views and my personal experience. And I hope that you would appreciate that sort of going away from this event and saying, Scott said this happened at the University of Manchester, probably isn't going to help, but I think it's important to share. To pick up on some things that Alistair said, I am embarrassed as a scientist to show you the only data slide I've got to show you here today, and how very, rudimentary the data is. We've found data incredibly difficult to collect, not only knowing what we can collect, but also having systems and processes which makes it easy for this to then analyse and doesn't make it a hugely laborious task to pull data out. So I've essentially, the only data I'm going to show you is about male-female, because that was the only credible data that I could actually pull out. The things I'm going to talk about are a sort of pilot scale activity that I ran as Associate Dean for PGR, and also a little bit about what we've done in the CDT. It's pilot scale because I realised very quickly, very early on, that in order to do any of this, what actually needed to happen was a change of culture. And a change of culture in any organisation is difficult. In a Russell Group university like the University of Manchester, it can be very difficult. In some faculties, it's easier than others. So the only way I could affect change was basically to use money that I had, or budget that I had control over. So what I'm going to talk about represents about 77% of our PGR population, recruitment population, because that was money that I could effectively control, and therefore I could set parameters. So really this is my attempt at widening participation, diversity, inclusivity, equity in PGR 101. I don't have any of the answers, and really I want to provoke sort of thought and discussion and get feedback from you guys about what you've tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked. And also what I'm desperate for is data, because the blocker I run across all the time when I try and take this to seniors is, where's the data, where's the evidence, how can you show? Okay, so that's a preface of what I'm going to talk about. Is that next one? Yep. So, as I said, it's very much a work in progress. What I've tried are those things on the screen, and we'll go through each of them sort of fairly briefly. So we've looked at anonymising applications. We've developed PGR person specification. That's very much an attempt to change culture in terms of, yes, we want to, my dean and the seniors in the faculty fully buy into, we want inclusive recruitment, we want widening participation, we want equity in recruitment, but they also say, but we have to maintain quality. And that's a really difficult question. So I say to them, well, how do you define quality in PGR? How do you actually define that when you come to recruitment? And they'll say, well, first-class degree from a Russell Group university obviously means they're going to be a good PhD student. There's no evidence for that, and there's absolutely no correlation. And I'm sure we've all got apocryphal stories of, you know, someone with a 2-2 from, you know, a university in the middle of nowhere that's been an absolutely fantastic student, and likewise someone with a first-class degree from a top Russell Group university who hasn't been a good student. So that's a really difficult conversation to have, and there's no data, no evidence for me to back that up. So to change that culture, we thought about what are the qualities you need to be a good researcher, and trying to get our colleagues to think about that when they're looking at candidates. And then on from that, we've looked at standardising questions and panels. We've looked at the idea of pre-sharing questions, that we don't disadvantage either people with neurodiversity or people whose supervisors are sort of know what the questions are going to be and give them a heads up beforehand. We've looked at allowing groups to pre-record presentations, and then I'll come on, hopefully I've got time at the end, to sort of summer internships. So, anonymising applications. We looked at it very briefly on a very small pilot scale, and we didn't pursue it for the reasons I think someone mentioned before. It had some effect of the initial sift, in that candidates maybe got through to the discussion with the supervisor that maybe wouldn't have got through. But then once they were eyeball to eyeball with the supervisor, from then on it had no effect. And it was so time intensive and so difficult that we actually decided that that wasn't the way forward. So then, as I said, we looked at a PGR person specification. That was really about my attempt to try and dispel this myth that someone with a first-class degree, then someone from Russell Group University, and someone with a 2-1 or a 2-2 would be a better researcher. And also, you know, when you look at what you have to do to get a first-class degree, you have to be good at remembering stuff, passing exams. They're totally different skills than you need to be a successful researcher. So this is, this might not be our final person specification, and I don't expect you to read all of it, but really it was about, what do we expect a PhD student to be able to do, other than have an appropriate background in the discipline they want to study, really it boils down to they should have communication skills, a relevant background. In some way, shape or form during a PhD, you're going to have to work in some sort of team, even if that's only you and your supervisor, often in interdisciplinary projects, especially in areas like energy. They're interdisciplinary, teams, so you're going to have some aspect of teamwork. You're definitely going to have resilience, because the first thing you do, you start with a Gantt chart on day 2, you screw it up and you write another Gantt chart, and that repeats for the next 3-4 years. You need to problem solve because of the resilience, and you need motivation, you need a reason for doing it. So those were really what we wrote our person spec around. And if you read any of it, what we tried to emphasise was that word potential. Nobody's going to have all of these things, but we want to try and evaluate whether they have the potential or they understand why those things are important. So, as I say, we developed standardised questions, and this was with the help from sort of everybody really involved in PGR, our EDI team, and also HR. And really, the presentation was around that helps us to judge communication skills. And one of the innovations there we had was, well, allow them to pre-record. And actually that was very popular initially, and then actually people stopped doing that, and I have no idea why they decided, but so the majority of people still do live presentations. The only time we insist on live presentations is we have a PGR that's very much, it has a huge teaching component to it, a PhD with a big teaching component, and so we insist for those students that they actually do a live presentation. These are all, by the way, either in person or on Zoom. They don't have to be all face-to-face. To talk about their motivation, so why do they want to do the project? Why is it exciting? What technical skills do they need to do that project? Do they have them? How might they develop them? What personal skills do they need? And actually that personal skills, those softer skills, we call them soft skills, but actually I never understand why we call them soft skills, because they're really hard, right? Those skills, I think that often, really gives you an insight into whether somebody really is starting to think about what a PhD might involve. Teamwork, so we appreciate that everybody at an undergraduate might not have had the opportunity to work as part of a team, but we also think that most undergraduates should be able to articulate the benefits of what working in a team might be, especially if you're trying to solve a complex problem. We ask them to give an example, but also mindful of the fact that everybody's had the opportunity. We say, we negate that question completely if they say, I just haven't had the opportunity to do that. I'm a mathematician. I've been sat in my room for 3 years working on pencil on a piece of paper. We talk about sort of adversity and resilience. So how do they cope when things go wrong? Give an example. It doesn't have to be from, your uni life. Give me an example from anything where you've had a problem, how you went about tackling it. And then we sort of ask them things on equality, diversity, so equity, diversity, inclusion and accessibility. And that's based around, we point them towards the university's website, and we just basically say, do you understand the concept? And at the University of Manchester, social responsibility is our third pillar. What might you do if you came here? What might you do to help us achieve those goals? And that last section isn't scored at all. That's just a sort of really for information flag for us. So if we look at some data, and like I say, I really apologise. This is as crude as it gets. When I took over this role in 2019, they assigned all these. So these are faculty fellowships. So we're talking about 40 fellowships per year. They assigned all these fellowships based on application only. So they basically sat in a room with a pile of CVs, and they've been doing this for the past 10 years. And, this person's got lots of qualifications, lots of publications, we'll give them a scholarship. This person's got no qualifications, we won't give them a scholarship. And the diversity data in terms of male-female look like the graph there, top left. When we introduced interviews, actually talked to the people that we might employ, and standardised questions, you can see we got a bigger jump, and then everything from then's really been quite incremental. So we developed our person spec, we adapted the standardised questions. Our initial standardised questions probably weren't as it's only when you start asking them you realise, I haven't really got that quite right. Then we introduced a standardised panel, and that was because our number of fellowships increased, and we realised that actually, if you have 12 different panels with 12 different, compositions, the scores are all over the place. So we set up 4 standardised panels with myself and each of my academic leads chairing them, and then had 2 other members of academic staff on each of the panels. And then we have a statistical way to sort of normalise against all the panels. You've got one panel scoring very highly, one panel scoring very lowly, and then we rank all the students across those 4 panels. And then the last thing in 2024, which actually was one of the hardest things to do, was to convince my colleagues that actually it's okay to share questions in advance, and it doesn't mean that everybody will come and have a perfect answer. And it really got rid of, I would say, the huge bit of inequity where some supervisors knew what the questions were going to be and they quite clearly briefed their candidates, and those candidates did very well. Other supervisors knew what the questions were going to be, but were stalwartly fair and did not share those questions, and then some supervisors had no way at all. So the only way to level that playing field is to share those questions in advance. And actually, that's quite telling, because when you shared questions in advance and someone, I think 3 things happen. Someone comes with a beautifully prepared answer, and these interviews are usually on Zoom, and they read it out. That sort of doesn't always convey the qualities you want. Someone sort of maybe has some bullet points and they've thought about the question and they talk around it. And some of them just, even though you've sent them the questions in advance, quite clearly haven't thought about it at all. And you can draw your conclusions from that as you want. Sorry, I've got that slide twice. So the last thing we tried to do, when I looked at who we were shortlisting, what I realised was that still the majority of students were coming from Russell Group universities. And I guess one of my hypotheses around that was maybe students from non-Russell Group universities didn't get the chance to do that research experience in their undergraduate sort of degrees, so they were getting sifted out early on. So we had some money from Urenco, which Urenco had said, we want you to do something in WP, do what you want. So we had these summer research internships, so it wasn't focused on nuclear at all, we put them in any area. And the aim was, so we basically put out an advert and we said, if you're an undergraduate research student at a non-Russell Group university and you're interested in getting some research experience, apply for one of these. We focused on the Northwest because we figured that these were over the summer, so the majority of people come home to live. And the idea really was to just improve their competitiveness and maybe even just get them to interview. And also give them an opportunity to find out whether maybe doing a PhD was for them. So we had 8 projects, over 70 applicants. We ran it as a pilot for the first time last year. And the other thing we did, which I think is really quite neat, is the last sort of people I wanted these summer interns to have as their supervisor, and apologies to any senior professors in the room, was a senior professor who probably wouldn't see them from start to finish and couldn't pick them out in a lineup. So we targeted these projects at postdocs and sort of early career researchers, because for me, that ticked 2 boxes. It gave that postdoc or that early career researcher a chance to do their own project and to supervise a student. And, the likelihood is they're going to be in the lab all the time, so they're going to be interacting with the undergraduate. And there's a couple of quotes there from PhD students, from 2 of the interns, actually. One was great. They weren't even a scientist by background and sort of used it as a start to their sort of switching, which I thought was a fantastic use of the project and one I hadn't thought about. The other very much came to us with, well, I think I might want to do a PhD, but because I haven't been to a Russell Group university, I need to do a master's next, and then I can start applying for a PhD. And then she realised that actually, I can go on and do a PhD, and that's what I want to do, and now I've got all this experience. So the next thing for us is to go back with those students and track where they are and what they've done next, I guess. And we have some money left from Urenco, so we'll be running this project again next year. So just wanted to move on to the Centre for Doctoral Training, which runs out of the University of Manchester, along with the universities of Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield, Lancaster and Strathclyde. So it's much more complex than my little faculty PGR problem, because it involves lots of university partners. But in many ways, we've applied many of the same principles. So we have, I hope, a standardised interview format and questions. We include the academic lead from each partner institution or their nominated sort of deputy on the interview panel to ensure consistency. We try and include a diverse range of supervisory teams. One of the big problems, I think, is that in this space, projects always go to the same suspects. We have a lot of our projects are co-funded by industry. Industry has links with certain academics. And one of the big challenges has been, so I've said to, say, academics at Manchester, you can't lead more than one project. So if you've got 5 industry halves, you're going to have to find 4 or more academics to help lead those projects. And that's really helped increase the supervisory pool. With enormous amounts of help from Becky and all the team. We've looked at gender checking, the sort of language in adverts. But more than that, and I think it was something Alistair said, it's about quality control in those adverts. You know, the adverts that go out, and I've fallen asleep, and I'm a technical person, I've fallen asleep, I haven't even got to the end of the title. So it's about how to frame those projects in terms of the big picture, you know, the why you're wanting to do what you're wanting to do. The technical detail can all come later, but that reframing of projects, I think, has made a massive difference on both the number of applicants, but also the diversity of our pool. We try to have a sort of, because we've got 6 universities that all have 6 different processes, we almost, in order to capture a pool of interested PGRs, we have a pre-registration process where they say, I'm interested in doing a PhD in this area, here's my CV, and then we can circulate that to all the universities in the pool. We also try, and again, this is a work in progress, but you know, if we interview a PhD student and we appoint 1, but we interviewed 5, and the other 4 were appointable, we say to them, you know, you only just missed out, you're really great, we'd love you in our CDT, here are all the other projects that are still available that you can apply for. And that generation of that pool of applicants and unsuccessful but appointable candidates is a work in progress, but I think we've got much better at it this year than the first year. And just to finish, so I guess if you look in the nuclear sector where this CDT is based, the industry baseline is around 20% female, and again, apologies for the crudeness of the data, and 80% male, and you can see that consistently, and this is the previous CDT that we ran, we're at about 40%, 38% female, 62% male into the sector, so or into that space. So we're consistently performing a good 18-20% above where the nuclear sector does. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much. Can I escape?
Okay, there you go.
Okay.
Okay, have we got any questions for Scott?
I thought I was going to get away with that then.
That was great. Thank you very much. I'm Caroline. I'm from the University of Warwick. I was just really interested in the quality controlling, the wording, the phrasing of your adverts. Where did you go to do the quality control, or was that sort of more instinctive?
So, in terms of the gender stuff, there's obviously software out there that you can use. In terms of the quality control, it was more instinctive. So certainly at Manchester, and I've encouraged all the other leads to do that. All the project applications come to me with their Find a PhD adverts, and I will basically send that back with actually a link to the Destination Nuclear Careers portal, because Destination Nuclear, I think, that's where all the industry jobs are advertised, and they have really taken this on board, and they write really super, really attractive job applications. And I say to my academics, look at this, because that's what you're competing against. And that seems to be, and I think also now, because we're in the second year of recruitment, people are seeing dividends. You know, I got 1 application. I didn't get any applications. I got 10 applications. So that sort of evidence of really, you know, you can't just sit there and hope good PhD students are going to come to you. You've got to sell the project. And I think these days, for the vast majority of undergraduates, they're looking for purpose. What difference can I make? What difference is this going to make? What's the real world impact? And I think that's so much more important to selling an advert than, you know, you're going to play with an NMR and then a mass spec and then a this, and you're going to analyse this fragment. You know,
I think as well. Sorry, I'm going
No, go.
Just so I did the ones for Strathclyde, and I think we have a slightly different challenge to you actually, in that the nuclear sector is very well regarded in the West and the Northwest because it's so big and it's such a massive employer that most people want to. There's a lot of interest in working in it, and there's a lot of there's not much kickback against it. Scotland is a when it comes to nuclear energy is a whole other ball game, and so I found that in trying to rewrite, it was not only about rewriting it in so I tried to say supervisors, if your 13-year-old can't understand this advert, then the chances the qualified undergraduate is going to understand it are slender, actually, because it's research-based, it's not to do with their undergraduate degree, and you're trying to interest them into it. So there's that bit, but I've also tried to really emphasise decarbonisation and the role that nuclear energy has to play in net zero in all of the adverts, because that's not the kind of reputation it has around us as well. So I think that has made a significant difference in the CDT. Sorry.
I think it's a good point.
Where you are, it's sort of, it's more accepted as an industry.
No, you're absolutely right. We don't have to do that hard sell.
Sorry, you can get it.
Great presentation, thank you. I was wondering if you've done anything to help people who are reluctant to apply, because people with atypical backgrounds tend to be more reluctant than typical backgrounds.
Yeah, again, only in terms probably of the wording of our adverts. So, you know, we don't tend to use. So we often won't use the word nuclear. We'll talk about sustainable energy. So in that way, yes. I think there's much more we could do, but without. So for me, and again speaking personally at Manchester, I didn't have the support from more seniors in my faculty of this is a way they want to go. I think there's a lot more we could do if we thought about it properly.
The Urenco stuff must help with that.
I think that will help, but that's the other difficult with PGR, isn't it? It takes so long, because a PhD is 3-4 years. It takes so long for the evidence to come through that what you've done has made a difference, that the people that you were trying to convince have either moved on or just don't care anymore. And it's how do you, it's generating that evidence and that base that I find really difficult.
Hello, Juan. I would say I was unexpectedly moved by the is it Urenco?
Yeah.
Urenco slide that blew my mind and my heart. So thank you. Boring question. Did you see any movement, or do you have any data in terms of who applied, the amount of applications you received?
So that's the next stage of work. So the first run of that pilot was just last summer. So it will only be this September 2025 that those students are starting to apply for PhDs. So the next stage of that project, well, whoever's the next associate dean, because today is my very last day, the next person who takes over that project, and I hope they will continue it should follow up that data and then see where those students went.
Scott, thanks very much. That was a really nice presentation. It's great to see all the things that you have tried as Associate Dean at Manchester and diversifying the pipeline. I'm in the CDT business of recruiting, so my question is slightly more towards after what happens when you go through the diversification and recruitment. So in the sector, last 10 years, there's a lot of things we have tried, some universities done, and you've shown a great example of all the great things happened. But what we are starting to see is, once we have diversified the PGR pipeline, and if they're not supported appropriately, that's when the problems have gone quite out of control in one way. So I'm just looking at your insight as a associate dean, how have you handled those support mechanisms? Because we are facing quite a lot.
Yeah, no,
So we have taken
absolutely.
positive actions, but then it's what do you do for the next 3-4 years to make sure they all succeed?
That's a great question, and we recognise that, because the last thing we want to do is get people in who wouldn't normally apply and then essentially set them up to fail. So this is only part of one part of a sort of 3-part programme that we've got running. So we've also made lots of sort of interventions in progression and completion and student experience. And we've started to work very closely with the Martingale Foundation, and they have a great, if you don't know of them in PGR space, I'd definitely recommend sort of linking up with them. And they have a great sort of package of, we're putting this person in, we can't set them up to fail, so cohorts of students, and we're really learning from them in that activity. But you're absolutely right, if you just parachute someone in and then just leave them, it's not going to be a good outcome.
So there's one, I think we need to shift on, but there is one more question about do you have any numbers on retention for these PhDs?
The answer is yes, but not at my fingertips. But in these schemes, the retention tends to be very good. Actually, our biggest issue with retention are from self-funded students. And our biggest issue, if I'm being honest, with recruitment is also from self-funded students. And that's a much harder problem to solve, because how can I go to an academic and he goes, this is my money, how are you going to tell me how I can recruit my PhD students? Which is why I would like this to show that actually, you know, this is a changing culture that we should adopt across PGR recruitment. Brilliant.
Thank you very much.